So he was a junior in high school when I started with them. I think he weighed like 200, 205 pounds. So we just, basically cut the volume almost by 2/3. And within the first month, his vertical increased like 5 inches.
Wow.
And again, it wasn't what I was doing with him. It's what, we weren't doing with him.
That was Mark McLaughlin, and you're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast. Today's podcast is sponsored by TeamBuildr. You can get a free trial of their training portal software by heading to teambuildr.com, and you can use the code JUSTFLY for a 30-day free trial. Sign up today with TeamBuildr and see what they can do for you for your training programs and your team. Welcome to another episode of the podcast. Thanks for tuning in. It's great to have you here. I'm excited to welcome back to the podcast Mark McLaughlin. He is the founder of Performance Training Center, and he works as a strength coach in the Lake Oswego School District in Oregon. Mark was recently on the show speaking on his creative and wide-ranging approach to athletic performance with an emphasis on athlete learning, movement training, long-term development, and also the importance of the aerobic system. Mark is known in the coaching industry for his ability to get results. And on today's podcast, he'll be going into a case study of an athlete he recently worked with who, in just over 2 years' time, put 2 feet on his standing long jump, 11 inches on his vertical. And within that case study, Mark will be speaking on the important aspects of athlete autonomy, the appropriate pacing and progression in training for not just short-term, but long-term results in that long-term viewpoint of performance. He'll be talking about plyometrics and jump training, hill sprints and capacity, and so much more. I really enjoy speaking with Mark. He has such a heart for athletic development and helping athletes get the most of their own journey of performance training. And that being said, let's get on to the show here, 398 with Mark McLaughlin. Mark, welcome back to the show. It's really great to have you back on, and I'm excited to chat today.
Yeah, Joel, thanks a lot. Love that we're having this reoccurring podcast going here. I love it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've just been really like a combination of both intrigued, especially with what you're doing more on the aerobic, the tempo, the heart rate side. And then I just love seeing like a lot of the athletic movements and athletic qualities, physical education and escalating that to the needs of athletes. And one of the things I think, we talked about last time was like aerobic and tempo and that's okay. I think so. Pendulums swing pretty hard. And you had a really good case study of a young athlete who you had worked with who just put an extraordinary amount of strength and speed on his frame. And you had a multi-part blog series on that. And I'd be curious for you to just share one, just about first maybe the gains the individual did make, because I think it's nice to have that precedent. And obviously all athletes are, we're going to have the bell curve of gains and responses, but share a little bit of that and then get into what you did with this young individual and how that training unfolded.
Yeah. So I wrote a 3-part series with an athlete that I had trained, Hunter Kavanaugh. And Hunter was exclusively an American football player. And I was fortunate to start with him when he was a sophomore in high school. And that was actually my first year at Lake Oswego. And so then, the series kind of covered what we did, what him and I did together over those, 3 years. And, his gains were, I think, out of the ordinary for, a lot of high school kids. Like, he started with me I believe his vertical was like 27 inches. And then he went to this lineman challenge this past summer, and his vertical tested out at 38.5 on a just jump mat. And then when I started with him, his standing long jump, I think, was 8 something. And at the same camp, he jumped 10 feet, 2 inches. And at that camp's been going on for 13 years. And, those records had stood for 13 years, and he broke both of those too. And I think it just kind of showcased to me just being, patient with these athletes, especially with Hunter, kind of understanding, him at the beginning as a person because he was already very dedicated. I could tell that from the first moment I met him. And so the challenge to me was, really kind of trying to put the brakes on him so he didn't get into any overtraining, where he was, maybe doing a lot of extra stuff outside of what we were doing, and kind of educating him on kind of my thought process on training, letting him tell me what he wanted to do, accomplish as an athlete, and then just kind of move the process forward. And just kind of, I mean, he, at the end of the 3 years, he trained 460 times with me. And as you and I were talking about prior to, starting here this morning, my goal is to get them to want to come back each session. And so I think, Hunter's work ethic, the fact that I think we made it fun for each other, to work collaboratively, I think at the end of the day, and the results kind of proved it, with him, it worked extremely well.
Yeah, that combination of having fun, athlete feeling like they have a voice, and the autonomy of the athlete in that process, or the ownership, and then consistency. It's like if you have those three things, I think you can go so far. And it's just kind of funny because I think that the main thing that a lot of people probably think of those three is just, well, consistency, which is really important. But it's like, well, what does it take to be consistent? Do you have to force it? I mean, and on some level maybe, but like there's other things that can really make that consistency just feel like a joy and not like a grind, all the time.
Yeah. And kind of my philosophy within, the constraints that I have at the school, because there's, we're kind of restricted on facilities sometimes, whether it be weather, teams, whatever. And so, you and I were talking about constraint led, coaching with athletes. Well, as a coach, sometimes I'm kind of constraint led as well. And so, kind of some of the things that I did to facilitate, fun and progress was, I started a gymnastics program per se within the athletic development model that I have there, and all the kids love it. So number one, and that's part of the warm up. So that's one, to get them there. The other thing that we do prior to training is game based. So they could play team handball, they could play ultimate football, ultimate frisbee. I mean, we have a rugby ball, soccer. So some of these other things to get them there. And then at the beginning, have the training be easy. So we did a lot of body weight circuits at the beginning. I think we had a year and a half. I don't know if I even touched on it that much in the article series, but you had Vern Gambetta on, I think, a couple of weeks ago, Joel. And if people haven't listened to that podcast, they really should. But we used a lot of Vern's circuits at the beginning. And I think building that easiness, the structure of it, body weight, mastering some of this stuff, and knowing Hunter's personality, how he did want to master even the basics. Like he wanted to come back every day to try to, do something different or improve. And, some points it's like, okay, man, I'm just going to let you do what you want to do today because, you don't even need me. You just want to be here so much.
And that just what you said is so important, is the athlete eventually like doesn't need you there. And I think a lot of coaching can breed this. It's almost like it can create a situation where, the athlete feels like they need you to tell them exactly what to do, or exactly what cue or technique or weight to put on. And unless some level of autonomy becomes cultivated in that package, I just think that's such a important piece as well. And you just mentioned it there, so I thought it was certainly worth saying.
Yeah, and because team sport coaches, and you hear it a lot, they want these kids to be leaders on the field. They want them to show their teammates what to do. And my thought process, and I totally get that, it's a skill that's learned. And so they need to have time within their day where someone's not telling them what to do, because they have the teachers doing that all day.
Mm-hmm.
They have their parents doing that. So how can I foster a culture that allows them to have their voice, do what they feel they need to be doing, and make mistakes sometimes, but then also, have a big success. And they have to learn how to be leaders. And in order to do that, you have to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. So within the training, I know something that you had said a long time ago. I think it was a case study, or you may have just been talking about an athlete's training. Now, this may have been almost a decade ago. I'm not really sure. But you had talked about something to the tune of delaying like the depth jump exercise for a long time, like not doing depth jumps until an athlete was 18 or something like that. I forget the exact age, but I think it's so common. Hank Kryenhoff, and I think Jeff Moyer was the one who had pointed me out to Hank's term acceleritis. We suffer in this country from acceleritis. Everything and like the barbell stuff. Okay, we got these middle schoolers. Let's get them on the 5-3-1 and triphasic or whatever. Whatever advanced lifting program. It's pasted into younger and younger and younger athletes training. And the same thing with plyometric work or whatever training you are doing. And so I wanted to ask you, because you were just kind of talking about how your training is patient, either as you just mentioned or even before we pushed record. And I wanted to go over a little bit about how you approach some of those modalities. And maybe we could talk about strength first, like how, and obviously the results spoke for themselves there. And we've talked about some of the results you've gotten on the last podcast as well. But tell me a little bit about the patience in the strength development that you took with him. And so where you started barbell work, like squatting, deadlifting, times throughout the year, it may or may not have been in the program. And let's start there.
Yeah. Part of what, and I'll talk specifically to, I'm just kind of broad strokes here, and then I'll kind of narrow it down with Hunter. Kind of my philosophy throughout my career as a coach, which is, 25 years now, has been to just let the kids develop through movement at the beginning. And one of the reasons, because in society now, people say, well, kids don't play enough, they're not outside, blah, blah, blah. And maybe that's true for some. So as a coach, and when I'm starting off with kids that are younger, it's like, okay, if that's the case, then let's have them move. Let's have them do gymnastics. Let's have them do crawling. Let's have them do jumping. Let's have them do sprinting. Let's have them chase each other. Let's have them play tag. You can build strength with these kids in just a number of different areas. And so you're developing those general qualities. And then as they begin to get older, and through the coach's eye and everything, and you're watching them, then maybe you begin to build in some skill acquisition within the weight room. So, strength training literacy. So, can they hinge? Can you teach them how to squat? Can they lunge? And that's why Vern's body weight circuits are such a piece of art, because you're incorporating all that stuff, plus you're facilitating some physiological demands on the athlete, and they're getting these movement skill. So there's a lot of things that are being solved within 4 exercises. And then as they get older, I don't know, freshman or sophomore in high school, and now I'll kind of narrow it down here to Hunter. His brother Hayden, who was, I think, 2 or 3 years older than him, was a really good weightlifter. And so he taught Hunter, I think, some of these skills, because when I asked him to squat, even body weight, he was really good at it. So I didn't have to spend a lot of time teaching that. He already kind of had this literacy built in. And then with other athletes, kind of the same thing. We need to teach them those skills. And then as they progress, then later on, if depth jumps, and with Hunter, it was very basic. Like, we did a lot of jump squats with barbells and dumbbells. We did do some depth jumps at the end and a little bit of contrast training, but he didn't need a lot to get those results at the end.
Yeah, I know Christian Thibodeau had talked about like contrast training, is that And every athlete's going to be different. Like he had talked about some athletes who just naturally are very skillful, very athletic. They might need less of that than somebody else who's just needs more like in the middle to fill in the gaps. And it does kind of speak to, I think, almost the skill of learning what you don't need to use. I think that's a skill just as much as learning what you do need to use. I mean, I guess it's the same thing kind of, but I think that's a skill we don't talk about so much. Hey, I didn't need to use this. This guy or girl was already a good athlete. Like we just did this instead, versus it's much easier to just unload the kitchen sink on every athlete.
Yeah. I mean, I learned really early on from one of my mentors, Val Nasedkin, who, his quote was, the exercise is, not as important as when and how you apply it. And so that's always kind of stuck with me. Like, yeah, squatting is good, but okay, how can we use it to develop this athlete? Do they need more slow twitch work? Do they need more fast twitch? What does the sport require? And I had 3 different athletes that I wrote a series on. This is back in 2006 when I had my own training facility. I always kind of felt back then I was kind of like the last stop shop with some of these athletes who had just been destroyed. And the series was like doing when less is more. And the first kid I talk about, Matt Hauk, he was overtrained, like I think in a classical sense, kind of what we didn't do with him. Owen Marisic, who ended up playing for the Cleveland Browns. I started with him when he was a junior in high school. Same thing, like he was training 14 times a week.
Oh, wow.
The results we got from him. And then Kevin Boss, who ended up playing for the New York Giants, won a Super Bowl with them. Kind of his journey, through a 2 or 3 year period there where it's same thing. It's what we weren't giving him, which I felt kind of lended itself for him to develop. So, there's a lot of different ways to coach. And like you just said, sometimes it's what you don't do that is more beneficial.
Yeah. I'm sure being able to track, I mean, I think any athlete that comes in and says, yeah, I've been training, 14 times a week. I don't think you necessarily need a metric or a monitor to be like, hey, you're overtrained. But I'm sure it's interesting to also be able to, as they do start to detrain from that, so to speak, or just to train appropriately, I'm sure it's nice to have an Omega Wave and things to be like, okay, here's where we were, here's where we are now. And as you're able to move their training load. Before I wanted to ask you a little bit more about, within Hunter's case study, you had talked about a time in the year where I think it was like the only lifting he was doing or barbell work he was doing was bench pressing. I do want to get to that, but actually I am curious in the context of what you just said. What did you do? So those athletes who came in who were 14 times a week, I mean, did you have them like, hey, I'll see you twice a week or something? And, what was the process there to kind of get them out of that overtraining state? Because I think there's a lot of athletes in that bucket, obviously, today.
Yeah. So the one thing that I think about those is you're dealing with I think a North American mindset of I have to do more. I have to do more. And so part of the challenge from a psychological standpoint is trying to sell them on training less. So that was the biggest challenge at the beginning on all 3 of them. And for example, with Owen, we took him down to 3 days a week of lifting. Maybe it was 2, more aerobic work. And so he was a junior in high school when I started with them. I think he weighed like 200, 205 pounds. So we just, basically cut the volume almost by 2/3. And within the first month, his vertical increased like 5 inches.
Wow.
And again, it wasn't what I was doing with him. It's what, we weren't doing with him. And then, so fast forward at the end of 6 months for his senior year, he was 235. And, he he squatted 365 pounds 20 times at one of his school tests, which was stupid. And then he went on to play at Stanford. He played both ways there. He scored an offensive touchdown and a defensive touchdown against Notre Dame in consecutive plays. I think the only college player to do that. And then played 3 years with the Browns. So, I mean, and with Hunter, this, just trying to build up, and from a training standpoint, the reason I only did legs at the beginning and lower body stuff was building up those tendons and ligaments, was kind of my, just getting him durable to then be able to withstand training as he got older with the lower body. And what high school kid doesn't like the bench press?
Of course.
So,
yeah, I think that is something that, I mean, you can make all the cases against bench press from whatever perspective. And to be honest, at some point, I think around age 36, I finally did my shoulder in a little bit. We were doing it was a lift every day type program thing, which actually was working pretty well at the time, but my shoulder's just getting destroyed. But I mean, outside of that, I just think at some point, with high school boys, like, bench press is bench press. Like, you could make excuses for why not to do it, but it's kind of like, it's just something that they love doing. Like you said, it's something that they love doing. So I think that's part of the equation, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would let the kids write their own upper body training once a week.
Really?
It's like, okay, I'm just here today to be a safety monitor. You guys design the training how you want it. Go for it.
Yeah, that's awesome. This is a little bit of a random question because I did want to go back to a little bit of that strength question, but you mentioned two-way football player. I was thinking about Travis Hunter from Colorado, like plays both offense and defense, and I don't think I don't know of many other players who do that, and I'm not like, I mean, maybe there are, but what I'm trying to say is, I like people who gather the player loads for those players. They'll be like, their player load is like so off the charts. It's like so far in the danger zone. It just doesn't make sense, it from one perspective of things, I guess, from just a purely mechanical. But I wonder sometimes if there's like something that's like mental, psychological about those players, almost like maybe like a love for the game, or I don't know. Do you know what I'm saying? I'm just curious if you have seen anything generally from those players that maybe goes beyond just workload numbers or anything like that.
Yeah. And again, I've had two athletes that have played at the D1 level both ways. So my my sampling is very small here. So N equals 2. What I can say from a physiological standpoint, because both of them I tested with Omega Wave like extensively, they, at least physiologically, from what I saw within those tests, like their ability to recover and their durability, from an autonomic standpoint, was like phenomenal. So that just their ability to recover from session to session is off the charts. I think that's number one. And number two, to your point on the mental side, does that robustness and recovery ability lend itself to their personality to just want to be able to go? Because Owen, as he got healthier and as we got into college and pro, like his workload, when we did put a lot of stress on him, was, I mean, we had sessions where he was hitting 30 to 35,000 pounds of tonnage on squat at like 85% plus of his maximum. And the next day he was coming back and was ready to go again.
Wow.
So,
yeah.
It's
interesting to think about what is it that creates that almost like superhero level of recovery, like, is it like what in the physiology or what in the mentality that goes hand in hand with the physiology? I don't know what the answer is. I'm genuinely curious.
Yeah. Cause I mean, then there's other athletes who, and they're older, because I got a couple D1 athletes that couldn't make it through a couple body weight circuits. It's like, okay, like they actually spent a scholarship on you and you can't
Yeah.
even do this, which then lends itself to the skill itself is so, you're just so good at what you do. It doesn't matter just how bad you are on the physical side.
Yeah. 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 It's crazy. Yeah. The spectrum of what you see is pretty wild, like with that. Yeah. So back to the strength piece, because I did want to ask you a little bit about. I just think one thing that intrigues me that I find interesting is, like, well, you're an athlete and there's a weight room, so you're going to do like squats, deadlift, bench, clean, bench, or I said bench twice, but you're going to do all these. You're going to do all these main lifts year round because there's a weight room and you know what I'm saying. But like, I found this actually just kind of intuitively growing up was. I think in my time with basketball and track, there'd be these times in the year where I guess just intuitively, I was like, I'm strong. I think I'm just not going to lift for the next, month or two of the season. Or maybe even in basketball, it'd be like, I usually go down and lift some weights in my basement after practice in the evening for a little bit. But practice is tough. I'm just going to take a little break here. And I think it was some of those times, especially those maybe like 3-week stints where I just had too much going on and had to take a break. But then I found like my performance would be extremely explosive in that short-term break that gave me the confidence to do that. But I think I don't know. It's unless you've been through those situations though, either personally or through coaches that have kind of had, been able to let off like that. Even in my time working with swimming at Cal, the coaches, the taper process in swimming is like almost like a sacred thing. It's way bigger of a deal than it is in track, I've found. And each athlete, coaches go to great lengths for each athlete. Okay, this person needs to stop lifting here. This person needs more rest. This person. And it's very intuitive of a process. But it was always very interesting because it's, if you're the strength coach and you see this swimmer who's like, well, I haven't seen this swimmer in the weight room in like 3 weeks and they just killed it, in their championship or whatever. And it's always intriguing it puts pieces in your mind as to what should be and where, how long could you rest from it? How long could you rest from heavy lifting? Anyways, all I'm trying to say is, I was just going to ask you a little bit more about, barbells throughout the year, more circuit or general training throughout the year. How did things change on that front? And what,
Yeah. I mean, that's a great question. And it really kind of goes to performance is just so nuanced within, an athlete, sport, the culture within those schools or sports. So regarding like kind of the cycles throughout the year, especially at the beginning when they're really young, like, freshman, sophomore, like just trying to get them exposed to as much movement as we can get them. So they're, this zone zero of, it's not even going to be really taxing at all. You're just going to move, you're going to get fitter, you're going to get healthier, and you're just going to get used to kind of using your own body. And then we're going to build up these skills within the weight room or jumping or whatever. And then as they kind of progress and you kind of see maybe are some athletes, reaching that puberty phase sooner, rather than later. Okay, so now maybe you start introducing them to a little bit more external, stress, whether it be through dumbbells or barbells. And then, are they playing other sports? How are they coming into training? Like, are they, getting better? Do they feel like they're, accomplishing things? So then maybe you can build up the load maybe a little bit more and just watching them and understanding that the process at this time throughout, even with some kids like a month, like, on January 1st, they're 110 pounds. And, January 30th, now all of a sudden they're 120. They've grown, say, 2 inches or something. And, they can hardly walk, without falling down. So there's a lot of these things that I'm kind of looking at that is kind of helping me maybe build the training a little bit, differently. because strength to me is like the easiest quality to improve, bar none. So I just want them to be able to move good and to be able to explore these movements that are, I think, going to help them within the sport themselves. If that answers your question.
Yeah. So within, like you said, there was that time period where the only barbell movement Hunter was doing was bench press, which I think there's something to that too, in the sense of sprint training, for example, with like Charlie Francis and Ben Johnson, and using bench press as a potentiation tool. It's something that's very, if it's meaningful and activates a lot of motor units, then it's, I think, just that, almost just the very general, that you could call like the organism strength, like just that general nervous system. And you're doing other basic lower body, like the Gambetta leg circuit, all sorts of calisthenics and gymnastics. It seems like, I guess you would ask the question, at this stage in the game, do you need to, for this block of time, do you need to squat right now? Do you need to do heavy deadlifts right now? Anything like that?
Yeah. And I think it's like with me, it's like with Hunter, because I knew that we would squat later on.
Yeah.
So, there were times where, we would do gymnastics or a game, and then we would do some, isometric stuff. And then he would do some leg circuits. And then we would do, I don't know, for 4 weeks, we would do a block of like teaching squat where the load was, well, although he already knew how to squat pretty well, but the load was relatively low, say like 95 to 135 pounds. And he was just practicing that skill. Are we getting the depth right? Does he feel good? Is he locked in? And we would do that once or twice a week. And, then I taught him, the, RDL. So, teaching him some of this basic stuff that I knew that we would be using later on. And it was sprinkled out throughout the year. So it's not like we never did it, but it never really was the focus. And actually, a lot of things just were never the focus. It was everything is the focus.
Yeah.
At this point.
Yeah. I like that.
And the lifting we do is very basic. Like, we're not doing a lot. We will do squat. We will do hex bar deadlift, RDLs, back extensions. I mean, I would say that our exercise portfolio with the basics is maybe 10 to 15 at the most. And just trying to master those as well as we can. And then I can use them throughout their career as they get older to try to drive some of these physiological adaptations that we want to try to achieve.
Today's podcast is brought to you by Lost Empire Herbs. You can save 15% off of my favorite products with Lost Empire Herbs by heading to lostempireherbs.com/justfly. Use the code Joel15. Lost Empire Herbs is a go-to of mine for supplementation. And looking at the principles, the patterns in nature is such a profound, a powerful, observing a starting point for me in my training. And I've taken that over into supplementation, or my choice of supplementation, as Lost Empire Herbs has harnessed the power of nature, getting things with such minimal processing and such a rich history in Chinese medicine for helping you to improve your vitality, energy, and even strength through their products, things such as Shilajit, the Phoenix Formula, and so much more. Head to lostempireherbs.com/justfly today and check out some of my favorite herbs. And there you can get, again, 15% off your order. Yeah, you had mentioned Vern Gambetta's podcast and the discussion on creativity. I think we all have it in us that we want to be creative. I think the interesting thing happens, though, like for you and I, so much of that creativity is expressed through movement, through gymnastics or calisthenics or just skilled body weight activity. And I think if you aren't doing something like that, then a lot of the creativity might be like, all right, well, like you said, you have 15 basic or major movements in the gym, barbell movements. It might become, all right, well, that 15 might become 30, and then you aren't doing the creativity, the actual like more athletic, you could say. So, and you could certainly be athletic with a barbell, but the more like body weight, athletic, calisthenic, gymnastic, then I just think that in general, physical preparation, like leave some creativity to go around, in that's like you said, in everything. Otherwise, I think when just the barbell work takes the creativity, I think that maybe leads to a little bit of over intensification too, because you kind of have no choice. It just, if you're gonna, because it's hard to probably be creative with a barbell type situation and not have it just escalate more quickly than it's probably ideal for the athlete.
Yeah, and I view, like, when kids go to play their sport, like, I want to try to make them as robust and durable as possible. And strength training is part of the equation, but then there's, how do you get out of bad situations? Like, there's that picture of Mahomes,
Yeah,
I think over the weekend, where he's in that weird position, and
like a back bend.
yeah, yeah, and people are like, well, he was lucky, but hey, as part of that, the reason he didn't get hurt was just part of his upbringing through a multitude of training experiences. And so I feel like the more experience I can give the athletes in moving and getting out of situations, maybe when they get in bad situations in a game, they're able to respond in a way that keeps them out of the risk of injury, not preventing it. Again, I'm not saying that what I'm doing or anybody else is doing is preventing it, but again, maybe it's giving them a chance. So, and again, when you get when you ask kids, I think this is part of coaching in this country that is it's just bad to me, is we're never asking the athletes what they like.
Yeah.
How do you feel about the training? Do you like what we're doing? No, I don't. Okay. Then let's figure out what you do like to keep you coming back. I mean, I do a questionnaire with every team twice a year to find out through my program, like what they like, what they don't like, my coaching style. So I can then refine this thing year to year to make it truly athlete centered.
Yeah, the next like escalation question was going to be about how you progress the plyometric program, but I'll skip to based on what you just said, actually, I will skip to like the aerobic and tempo component, both, I guess, of Hunter's program, but also, and I know because we talked about that last time, is people in today's age of social media or whatever, the way training is disseminated, like the pendulum swing, and you might think, oh, well, the aerobic system isn't important at all. Well, let's just ignore it and only train, only train power, or only train speed. And I know that's been an important, the aerobic piece is an important component of your programs. And obviously it wasn't hurting Hunter's ability. But I was going to ask you, like, that seems like an interesting thing because that's the part of the program, it would seem like, at least not for every athlete, there's a lot of workhorses out there, or if you think of athletes, if they're like, cats, dogs, or horses, or or whatever. I guess a cat probably wouldn't like the aerobic part or the tempo part, but there's some athletes who love it, probably too much, honestly. So I'm just curious how that breaks down with how do you fit that conditioning side to what the athlete likes? I'm really curious with that one.
Yeah, and that's another great question. I'll kind of go back to my progression as a coach. So, I started off, following, Louis Simmons on, strength, and Dave Tate. So, elite fitness, Louis Simmons, like, bands, chains, like that's how I started. And I think within my peer group, Landon Evans and some of these other coaches, who I still, talk to, that's kind of how we started. Now on the speed side, it was Charlie Francis. And, Charlie was, his short to long or long to short. And, thankfully Derek Hansen has, really, kind of taken what Charlie taught him and put it out to us now in such a great manner that, Charlie will, continue to live on. But, Charlie did a lot of tempo work with his sprinters. So that was kind of how I started. And then as I started to learn more about the aerobic system recovery, then I met Val at Omega Wave. you started understanding the autonomic nervous system. And so it's always been a part of the plan and the kind of my philosophy. And then I've been able to test a lot of athletes that did a lot of this work or didn't do any, to continue to kind of formulate why it worked. And then for your listeners, if you go back and listen to Randy Huntington's podcast with you, and Randy's fortunate where he can do a lot of pool work with his, athletes, but, even Randy talks about the aerobic system and as a recovery tool. Mm. So I'm looking at it more as, we did a hard workout on Monday that was very CNS intensive, for lack of a better term. How am I going to get Hunter to then be able to come back on Wednesday to go hard again, or come back on Friday? And through my career, that tempo work, bike work, aerobic work has always set the athletes up to continue to build that capacity to then recover, to be able to do higher workloads, higher intensity, come back better the next day. So that's how I think about it. I mean, I have a Navy SEAL right now I'm working with who, like, his workload is like so high, and he's doing 5 or 6 hours a week of aerobic work. He can run a sub 6-minute mile, and he can deadlift like 500 plus pounds. And he's a 200-pound athlete. So, I mean, I don't know if that answers your question, Joel, but I've never seen it hinder anybody ever.
Yeah. Yeah, it is, especially too, I think the individuals that it hurts is, it's just like coaches who apply it with no nuance and just more is better. And they're probably taking athletes too to a level of like lactate within that aerobic work constantly as well. It's and I don't, maybe too, I did want to kind of get into maybe talking about the exact nature of some Hunter sessions, because I think that would give a little bit more clarity. I think a lot of people might hear aerobic and they might think of like the worst workout their coach made them did, or right. Those of us who work with athletes who go off to their sport coach and just get creamed, with whatever aerobic conditioning, just like silliness. Maybe they're mixing CrossFit in there or something. I mean, I think we all know those athletes who have to deal with that stuff.
Yeah.
And so what, tell me a little bit about I know you talked about last time, but about some of that nuance and maybe get into the, what you were doing with Hunter in that realm.
Yeah. So with the kids, I'm always educating them. So I will talk briefly about, the aerobic system and the autonomic system and, mitochondria and just, the basics of kind of why this work is important. And if they want to just be, beast, from first quarter to fourth quarter, this is why this work is important. And so I started off at the beginning in Hunter's career as a sophomore, like, we were doing, I don't know, 12 to 1600 yards a session with tempo twice a week, I think. And it was, that's 28 to 3200 yards. I mean, that's like half a mile total for a week.
Yeah.
So, and when people get upset about doing that work, it's like, okay, well, you have bigger issues within what you're doing with the athlete. You can't even program that. And so, starting him off doing that very simple work. And then as the years progressed and his workload on the field became more like through his junior and senior year, because he was playing both ways. And if you kind of look at practice data with, total yardage run in practice, how much he was running, potentially in a game, like they need to get that time on their feet, throughout the week and kind of learn how to withstand that from a durability standpoint. So, I mean, at the height of his training through his junior and senior year, like, he was doing like 7,200 yards total in a week. And some of that was, intensive tempo, just because that's the way practice is.
Yeah.
Um, but he thrived within those sessions, and I can back it up with kind of how he looked on HRV for training. I could tell, what his resting heart rate was doing, throughout these, heavy periods of training, on top of testing him within the power work that we were doing, whether it be through vertical jump or standing long jump. And there was no hindrance to his performance. And so, again, it's understanding the demand of the sport, building these athletes up, slowly, giving them the context of why it's important, and then getting feedback from them. Like, how do you feel during practice now? Oh, it's hard, but it's not hard. And then you look at game film and all this, and they're, playing extremely well. They're recovering. And so all these things that I think goes on social media of, you should never condition, aerobic work is worthless, comes from I think a uneducated point from a physiological standpoint on what humans need to kind of thrive in these high stress situations.
Yeah. I think some of it too can come from kind of like almost if that quality has been taken to the point of abuse, like you could even say like bilateral squatting or bilateral deadlifting taken to the point where athletes are getting injured, like pendulum swinging all the way the other way, or seeing athletes who are over conditioned, which is certainly, or especially over conditioned at the expense of speed and power and even like play and things that are joyful in nature and like that. I think that can, that's, I think, a pretty common rationale, but it is interesting for me because that's something I've thought about. I've thought about, especially in the scope of like track and field. Well, is active recovery best on those off days, or is doing nothing? And I think, I don't know, sometimes I almost wonder too, and this is where I think having, those monitoring tools is that fantastic way to help answer that well. Because I've heard of coaches who do both of those things, some who just do complete rest. And just for me personally, I think maybe I come from it a lot of place where I just personally enjoy doing something. Like I like just going out and moving my body or whatever it is. Even then, I would say almost the best recovery day for me was actually playing racquetball. It's just like fun. You get to track a ball. It's like low level. And like that was always really fun. It's kind of like and I'm sure there's so many possible ways to do it, but that is a thing I still do consider from time to time, is what makes it ideal to do one of those or the other, total day off versus an active day and aerobic day and things like that.
Yeah. And I think, again, talking to the athlete on what they like to do, what they prefer. Hunter would go out for hikes on the weekend,
Yeah.
And because high school kids, like, I think if any group should have consistent monitoring with HRV, I honestly think it's high school kids because of the school load. And I've done surveys with them. Like, on average, I think our kids spend 28 to 35 hours a week in school.
Yeah.
And then, it varies 2 to 8 hours a week of homework. And then you have your sport. So just the overall general stress that is imposed upon them is quite high. And you need to understand we're dealing with human beings here. And so, just because you have a training session planned, it doesn't mean that they're going to be able to, benefit from it because they're just overworked.
Yeah.
And track and field, I don't know. There's just some sports like track and field it's just so, the kids just get beat up so bad. It's like they're in a contact sport,
Yeah.
at least in the high school. So,
yeah, I know for me, when I first got to college and I didn't have to go to class all day, I was like, this is amazing. Like, whatever I spent all my life. Like, yeah, it's sometimes I think you take that for granted. So I'd like to get into the plyometric piece and then a few other questions. So you mentioned you eventually got to depth jumps, but how does the plyometrics unfold in terms of, managing intensity, deciding how and when to take those escalations, and then maybe talk about, well, you got to depth jumps with Hunter. Like, what's the end game with what you look for in your plyo program?
Yeah. So like when he was younger, it was, a lot of rudimentary, um, jumping. So jump rope and, skipping and, skipping with the jump rope and, ice skater jumps, pogo jumps. I mean, just a lot of low level things. And then even within the gymnastics program, there's, quite a bit, or there can be quite a bit of jumping if guys are trying to do backflips
Yeah.
consistently. And so just organically, they're getting a lot of it. And so that's kind of how we started it out. And then, like, into his junior year, then it became a little bit more structured. So, okay, we're going to do, you know, 2 or 3 series of 30 box jumps at varying heights with specific rest periods. And but again, just kind of basic jumping up and seeing how he landed and all those types of things. um, and then maybe we start going to some low hurdle jumping. So whether it be on a 7 or 12 inch hurdle, working on some, more reactive stuff off the ground. We may even go to a low depth jump from there at the beginning. So maybe dropping off a 6 or 12 inch box and just, teaching them how to, kind of get off there, and more on a horizontal pattern with those things at the beginning. Um, you know, I also, uh, would have them just practice dunking a basketball if they could, or trying to dunk it with a tennis ball, because they love it and the intent is like extremely high. And I mean, this past year I bought a adjustable hoop for the weight room.
That's awesome.
So we were doing different dunks and different jumping activities. And so but then kind of going back to Hunter, and then as he got into uh, preparing for his senior year, it was okay, now we're going to do jump squats with 30-40% of his max back squat. So now it's we're intensifying this. And he's doing, I'm tracking it with the bar monitor to make sure that his speed is good. And then we're starting to do depth jumps at higher heights. So we're going from I think I started him at 18. I think the highest that Joel I got at the end was, I think he dropped off a 30-inch box. And at first it would be drop down and jump up. And then as it got closer to the season, I mean, I don't know if specificity is really pertains here, but then it was more of, okay, drop and then jump out.
Yeah.
Um, and then, okay, drop, jump out, and then jump up. And so there was even more complexity. And then we did at some point some hurdle bounding from higher hurdles. I think he was doing 24 inches. I think we were doing like 5 to 6. And we would do those to a sprint as well. And so, that's kind of how we topped out at. And that was like 3 weeks before that competition that he went to. And you could just tell by the way he was moving and everything that his response to this stuff was just like unbelievable. Um, so, I knew that he was capable of, jumping quite far.
Yeah, you mentioned the low rim hoop, and it made me think, and the intent, and it made me think a little bit of bench press. So it's almost like if you had to pick only 2 things for high school boys to do in training that they would be the most passionate about doing, I feel like bench press and low rim dunks. Maybe trying to dunk on each
Yeah.
other, like one guy tries to block it and one guy tries to dunk. That might be the two. I think that might be a solid two to put in the training program for a lot of individuals. You got the lower and upper body, and the intentions are going to be there.
Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I grew up with three younger brothers. We had a dunk hoop that would raise from like 8.5 to 9.5 feet, and you would watch Julius Irving, dunk on somebody. Then you're trying to go out and dunk on your brother, the same way he did it. And so these kids, I mean, it's fun, and like you said, those two things, I think, yeah, you could run your whole training based off
Yeah.
of those two things.
I think it would be, it would be so interesting. Back when I did my master's thesis was on basically the role of intent and how does it change a depth jump. I had people just do a depth jump and just jump as high as you can. Like you're not trying to go over a hurdle or touch anything. You just jump in space. And then the other constraints were as you jump over a hurdle or you jump up and touch a vertex. And when there's goals or an intention, you jump higher or faster. But it would have been interesting to do a meaningful constraint, like, okay, here's a hoop. Now let's do it. All right. Now here's a hoop and someone's going to try to block you. I don't know if I could capture that in the lab, but that would be so interesting to see. Cause I would be willing to bet that especially if you've played basketball and it's not just a vertex, like it's a hoop and someone's going to try to block you. Like, I think there's going to be some higher rate of force development there at that instant of contact.
Yeah, I mean, so I have two tether balls at the school that I throw over the power racks and I pull them up, and I'll have kids, run and jump up and try to head those, like a soccer header. So the intent on that, like you have them just jump up and try to touch the top of the power rack. Then you put the ball up there and watch them, like how they look at the ball, like their run up to, I mean, it's like it looks like the intent has gone up like 1,000 exponentially,
Yes.
just simply hanging a little something up there to try to get them to attain. It's like, why wouldn't you try to expose? And that's why play, when we go back to this, that's why within the play structure with your friends, like that's constantly there.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And that's where this has gradually hit me more and more each year, but weighing everything done in training against, especially like agility, change of direction, like short speed stuff, weighing whatever you do against what you see happening in a game, the intensity and the speed and everything. And it's like, just because if I'm doing like an agility drill of some sort with some cones laid out, and just because I might make a cut that is, quote unquote correct, if it's 10% slower than what I did at the game, I don't know. Sometimes I just think about the stimulation, what my body is getting out of that thing, versus actual game speed, or just things that are there that are motivating, or just finding something in that drill that is motivating enough to get that extra power output to adapt to.
Yeah, I don't know if you follow hockey at all, but there was a hockey players from Russia, Pavel Datsyuk. They call him the Magic Man. And if people don't follow Mark O'Sullivan on Twitter, like I would highly recommend it. He's a researcher in Norway right now. I think he's originally from Ireland, but him and a colleague did a study on Pavel, how Pavel learned hockey growing up in the Soviet Union. And so one of the games, so Pavel liked to, when he was playing with his friends, like they tried to make the game, the constraints they put on themselves to make it harder or more enjoyable. Like it's extremely fascinating. And so one of the things that Pavel liked to do was he liked to play ice hockey in felt boots on the ice, and he played with a bouncy ball. And so it was creating, a totally different game that he had to start and stop differently. And so Marco Sullivan, and I forget the guy's name that wrote the paper with him, but they did a full research study on these constraints and economic constraints. And, they didn't have a lot of money for sticks. So Pavel, he didn't do a lot of slap shots because if his stick broke, he didn't know when he would get another one.
Hmm.
So that economic constraint was a advantage for him on how he built his game. And so I constantly think about this on the kids and how we're training them, like trying to put or have them put their own constraints within some of these things to just give them a totally different experience.
Yeah.
Kind of like what you and I were talking about the 5 girls that you were working with on the high jump.
Today's podcast is sponsored by the Plyomat. The Plyomat is not only an incredible vertical jump and reactive strength index testing device, but it also is an incredible training device. The Plyomat not only allows single response jumps, but also the chaining of multiple mats together. So you can use it for bounding, multiple series of hurdle hops. You can get not only height, but reactive strength for a multi-jump situation. It's an incredible, again, testing and training tool, and you can learn more at plyomat.net. Yeah, for sure. It is, it's funny because actually that was, like there's the gift of inaccessibility so many times. Like even with the high jump, we spent more time doing, that constraint-based jump drill to warm up where we just did 4 or 5 different types of high jump. And every time you completed them, we'd raise the bar. It was just the area, it had just rained. And so I didn't want them doing circle running drills to warm up with just their tennis shoes on. Usually I do those with tennis shoes. I could have had them do it with their spikes on, but I was like, I'm just going to take advantage. We're just going to put the spikes on and have some fun. And, it's those, sometimes the environment or a rainy day or whatever it is. When I was, my first depth jump program. So speaking of early intensification, you mentioned that you're holding off like the highest depth jumps till later on. And so I had done like the high repetition jump programs earlier in my like freshman year of high school, like 8th grade, like the air alert, like the do 150 squat jumps type thing. Well, what's interesting is people would see a program like air alert where it's just like the only way up is numbers and say, oh, that's a horrible program. It's just going to destroy your knees. Well, I actually never made it through the whole program, but the first 2 or 3 or 4 weeks of the program, I actually gained quite a bit on my jumping because it wasn't absurd yet, and it's like, yeah, dude, if you haven't been trained, like, I mean, for me, I hadn't been squat trained. So yeah, doing 2 sets of 30 or 2 sets of 40, like half squat bodyweight jumps was actually really, really good for me. Once it got up to a certain number, it was too much. But anyways, I got this book called The Science of Jumping or program. I think it's probably still out there. This was like 1999 or 2000, and it was a depth jump program. Basically, it was like, and it had some stuff you'd mentioned, like depth jump to long jump was in there, all sorts of depth jump variations. That was the program that actually told me don't do like distance running if you want vertical gains. And up until then, I had like loved distance running because my dad did it and I did it. I mean, I wasn't like 30 miles a week, but I'd go out and run like 2 or 3 miles at a time in 8th grade. And so stop doing that. I do love, caveat though with the aerobic, I do tempo sprints for me are especially over hurdles where it's kind of fun. That is my bread and butter, like 7x200 over hurdles at like tempo pace. That's my jam. Helps me recover good for my feet. But anyways, the depth jump, I had the economic constraint of, my dad built these boxes for me that were like not the world's greatest boxes, but I basically had 2 heights, so I didn't have like nice adjustments. But so I had to be kind of specific when I wanted to make the jump to the bigger box. But I started to figure out, and this is just me in my backyard on grass, and I started to figure out on my own, like I will jump higher if, oh, hey, there's a tree branch over here. If I go jump up and try to touch this tree branch, I think it feels more explosive. And so I would just like drag the boxes over to a tree. And whatever branch seemed attainable, I would just go and jump and try to touch that. And, and then maybe I'd find, and it would change on the day because, it might have rained, the tree branches are hanging lower, the tree grows or whatever, right? Like, but it's just kind of funny but I'll tell you, like, I think there was something about that autonomy in that program too, and kind of making it my own. I mean, on that program, I went from getting maybe my wrist, this is at age 16, my wrist probably like maybe a couple inches over the rim, maybe 3 inches over the rim, to elbow at the rim in about maybe like I would say about a 3 or 4 month time span with like the depth jump. I would say maybe I'll give myself a little more credit before. On a good day, maybe I could have got my wrist like maybe 3 or 4 inches over. But it was unbelievable how much I improved in a short period of time. And I do think the program and the buy-in to the program was substantial. But there was also something another thing I did was they had medicine ball throws and vertical medicine ball throws. And in the backyard, I had like these kind of telephone pole lines that was a weird neighborhood.
Oh,
I
nice.
didn't throw it over them. I think that would have been silly. I might have tried to once, but I always tried to throw it like up to the line. Like wherever the line was, I would try to
Right.
just throw it up and, to the level of the line. And so I had a lot of stuff kind of like that, funny enough. And, in the hindsight of being better at my sport, which I was trying to dunk for basketball, I should have had constraints for basketball, but ended up becoming a high jumper. So I guess, it all worked itself out. But I always loved those stories. It also reminds me too, just one other thing quickly is the book Bounce.
Yeah.
It was one of the first books I read on training and performance. It was like the fastest table tennis player in all of England, like the fastest meaning like literally his hand looked like it was probably like in the Matrix or something, where it's like, it's just like so fast back and forth. That guy grew up playing where the room wasn't big enough. And so he had to literally just butt up against the table, and he didn't have the luxury of like doing those big jumping shots that you see like in the highlight reels. He just had to react faster. And that's why he was so fast. It was an economic constraint. And I like that. Those are so cool because those are like the underdog story. It's like Rocky training in Siberia. Hey, what do I got here to train with? There's something
Right.
it's a story. And we don't talk about those things in training nearly as much as we should, because that's what makes so much of it fun and meaningful. And, oh, hey, you remember that gym we used to have to train in? Or like Joe DeFranco's 500 square foot closet. I remember him talking about that, when he was on the podcast a long time ago, and all the great results he got training out of that with individuals. So you got me on kind of on a little bit of a tangent, but it's a good one.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I think, Joel, what you need to do is you need to market your tree branch telephone wire. Somehow we need to come up with a name, and you can mail out tree branches and wire to your potential customers.
Oh yeah, for sure. Or maybe it's like the ancient samurai method or something. It's like as the grass grows, like you jump over it every day or something. So
right.
It's hard to, I don't know how much, you could just like charge for that, because it's like, well, you just gotta find a field and just have at it.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yep.
Those are it's or like, the picking the Milo picking up the calf as it grows up or whatever, so it's just so cool to think about all that. So just a couple more things here, Mark, before we finish up. One, I did want to ask you more about the hill sprints and some adaptations with hill sprints. Oh, I did want to say too, I had this thought, is you had mentioned plyometrics being more horizontal in nature initially, I believe. And I was just going to make a comment, is I think that in itself as a constraint, I think is really cool, because it keeps the contact times pretty quick. It keeps things more bouncy, and you don't even have to necessarily tell an athlete, hey, be quick off the ground in these vertical pogos that we're going to do in this variation. It's just like, hey, if you're covering horizontal distance, it kind of takes care of that itself. So I just thought that was, I just wanted to bring that up because I thought that was really, I think that's something that makes it a little easier and cleaner in that perspective of things.
Yeah, absolutely.
So anyways, so I did want to ask you about hill sprints, but I did want to say, because I know you go into this in the article that you have a 3-part, I believe, blog on Training Hunter, and you have like the breakdown of how you did the weeks and things like that. I'm curious, like what did a typical week look like? How did this come together in a training week? And how did that progress over time? I'm sure it wasn't always the same, right? And, there was input on his end, but just generally speaking.
Yeah. So like kind of the weekly template at the beginning was, we had 3 days. So like Monday, Wednesday, Friday, where it was, leg circuits, sprinting, basic jumping when he was, younger, like sophomore year. And so, on Monday, Friday, it may be, multiple circuits of, the body weight squat to a lunge, to a step up, to a pogo jump. And the volume on that would range anywhere from like 3 to 5 circuits. And then if you look at Vern's progression, over time, I would try to get Hunter to, do those circuits multiple times without any rest in between. So I think at the end, after say, I don't know, 4 to 8 weeks, he could do 5 circuits without any rest. And then from there, then we would move on to maybe a little bit more complex. On Wednesday, the circuit was a little bit different. So it was more, so we would actually use some resistance like through dumbbells. We would do, isometrics on those given days. But 3 days a week where it was, lower body focus. And then prior to that, we would maybe do some gymnastics at the beginning. He would do games with his friends, with the team. And then we would do some sprinting. And the way that the school is set up and the weather out here in Oregon is like it's hit and miss. So at the beginning, if weather was nice, we would run hills. And we would start off with 10 yards. I have like 2 hills that, range from like 10 to 30 yards. And so, we'd start off with, say, 6 or 8 of those and, do that 2 or 3 times a week, weather permitting. And then as he got older, after say, a year and a half, then the lifting on, Mondays and Fridays would be intensive, I guess, for lack of a better term. And then Wednesdays would be more of an alactic jumping day, almost like a Werner Gunther progression on the extensive side. And then as he got into his senior year, it was kind of the same setup, but it was just kind of how intensive those Monday, Friday sessions were. And then his junior and senior year, I actually started using like oxidative work with the lower body. Through like tempo squats at the end of his session to kind of add more layers to, his aerobic capacity, to build up his work capacity. So that was, and then tempo runs on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And then and I know we'll talk about it here shortly, but then we would do hill sprints, as a conditioning tool, which I can talk more about on kind of why we did that and kind of how I progressed it with him. So that was kind of the basic week.
Yeah. Yeah, let's finish up with that then, because the hill sprints for conditioning, I think there's some specific adaptations you're looking for. So yeah, tell me a little bit about that usage versus just pure speed.
Yeah. So, and again, this, so in 2007, Down the Sedkin gave a seminar at my training center. And this is where I first learned about, oxidative capacity of the fast twitch fiber. And, that term, the adaptations that Val talked about at that point, it was like a watershed moment. I think as coaches, we maybe have 2 or 3 of those aha seminars or things that happen that you read. And so that seminar that Val gave us changed the way that I thought about training and still kind of think about it today. And so the method that I use is it's an all-out sprint, either uphill or with the sled for less than 5 seconds. So you're recruiting as much, fiber, fast fibers as you can. But because the duration is so short, and, you don't want to exceed, your anaerobic threshold, that it's, purely aerobic. And, that's going to lend itself to repeatability within these team sports. And so that was, and that still is kind of the basis of these hill sprint sessions that I do with the athletes. But then you also get, I think, some residuals on the speed side as well.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a byproduct of that, because there's times at school where I can't do any sprinting on the field because we just don't have access to it because of lacrosse or baseball or track and field is using it. And so, the constraints of what I can and can't use kind of, okay, I have to do this because.
Yeah, it was. I was gonna say with take a quick note there. Yeah. So, I was going to say, you had mentioned even the speed residuals. And it is interesting because I think if you had mentioned like, okay, we're going to do, if it's a lot of sprints and it's a
Mm-hmm.
short recovery time, I think it's easy to only think, oh, well, that's only endurance. That's only speed endurance. But I found that I mean, I wouldn't make this the only workout, but if you've been doing a lot of just more shorter emphasis workouts, just short, high quality, a little bit more typical what we think of when we think of speed training, and you've kind of hit a plateau, I found workouts like that, like you mentioned the sled, like just this past year. I remember I started this because there was one day in the gym myself that I didn't have time. It was a speed day just for my own training, and I just didn't have
Mm-hmm.
time. And so a constraint. And I had like
Right.
15, 20 minutes. So I hooked myself up to a sled and I did every minute on the minute sprint for, it was probably about 15, 20 yards with the space I had. And so, I mean, that was not that long. It definitely didn't go into lactate for each one. It's a pretty short
Right.
burst, but it's every minute and you recover enough that you aren't, again, getting into that, you said anaerobic threshold. But it's, with the next day or two after that workout, I was like, man, actually feel pretty good. Like, and I started putting stuff like
Yeah.
that in some client workouts, and it was always met really well. It actually made me think there was one day, this was back to like, I think we talked about conditioning coaches and what was the worst workout. And I will say my freshman year of college, the distance coach was like the head track coach or the cross country coach. So of course, all the workouts were like way longer. And honestly, I had a really there was a lot of adjustments as being a freshman, but that was not a good year. I didn't jump as high as I did in high school for the most part. Slower, long jump was way worse. Not playing basketball anymore either hurt a lot. But yeah, so a lot of like just longer running that really wasn't that helpful or effective. And one of the workouts we did, though, I'll never forget it. It was in the fall, and we only did it once. And any workout you only do once is kind of like, oh, geez, here
Right.
we go. Like, it's like, oh, the mental. It's like, oh, let's do 100 hundreds or something. But it was a 20-minute hill run where you sprinted up this hill that was, I don't know, maybe it's like 80 meters, and then jog down. I think you had to jog back down. And it was high intensity. Like I was racing this guy, one of my training partners, up each time.
Mm-hmm.
And it was brutal. I mean, I was like dying at the end. But then the next day I was screwing up, like just in the gym shooting around. And I went to do some dunks and I was like flying. And I was like, I don't know what that did yesterday, but something good happened. And I wouldn't say
Right.
it wasn't one of those things where I wouldn't say, oh, yeah, do that every week or twice a week. I think it kind of loses whatever it gives you then. I think it's almost just one of those things where it just kind of digs into the muscles in a just different way, just due to the repeat nature. And maybe there's some elasticity stuff in there too, But ever since then, I was always a little bit more open to that idea of like, yeah, that repeat power, not just for the obvious, but also for just a little bit of that plateau breaking when you've kind of tapped out all the pure speed stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And with the team sport athletes, I mean, and it's all the rage now, like how fast you run in a game, or, I'm hitting 23 miles an hour. I mean, that's just like it's clickbait on, social media. And again, I mean, obviously, man, speed is important. I'm not saying that. But within sports of like football, lacrosse, basketball, it's about repeatability.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to build that repeatability through durability. And if you don't, then, when it means something at the end of the game, you just may not have the speed to be able to do it. And so with those hill sprints, like one of the things that I've done in the past is I've used pre-lap before, I've used some other GPS tracking just to, okay, we're going to do, 4 quarters of this, you're going to do 10 per quarter. Like, what is the speed and degradation through that? And, when do you start hitting, when do you start slowing down? And so to me, that data is important then to go back and start building some even more specific training to try to improve that capacity. Um, And I've even had Moxie monitor on the athletes that do that. It's like, okay, we're going to have GPS, we're going to have heart rate monitor, and now we're going to have a Moxie, we're going to have a timing gate, and we're really going to really narrow this focus down on, when stuff starts to go awry and why it's doing that, how it's doing that, and okay, how can I build the training to try to, improve those qualities?
Yeah. For the hill sprint workouts, like what would a sample be of, you said like 4 or 5 second bursts. How would the rest be? Like, what's the typical volume? Is there a drop off or like performance you're looking at?
So with the football guys at the beginning, like when I start those, and we can typically start them in like May, we'll do 20 reps of that, so I think it ends up being 20 to 25 meters for all the guys. And the rest is 50 to 60 seconds. And then I usually take the volume up to like 40 within those time frames with just the regular rest period. And then as we get into the summer, and now it becomes more specific to how we play the game, it's going to be 15 to 20 yards. So even now it's probably less than 4 seconds or 3 seconds even. And it's going to be a 30-second rest period. So it's specific to the no huddle offense that we run. And then we'll work up to 50.
Yeah. So
with breaks in between like quarters and halves.
Gotcha. So with the 40, you were saying before, like it's about a minute each. So like that's like a 40-minute workout or so.
Yeah. Yeah. And that method is Victor Selyanov, and I don't know if you've ever talked about him but that Val's method that he taught us, he got from Victor, who was doing that work, I think, back in the mid 90s. And so that's where the training method originally came from. And so those are the recommendations that I typically use there.
Yeah. I don't know if you were at the seminar. It was Jay DeMayo's seminar it was him.
Yeah, I was there.
Oh, nice. Yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah.
I remember
my intern at the time, Jake Jensen, I think, translated Victor's talk.
Yeah. I remember one of the things I remember very clearly about that was like, Victor, I think it was kind of what Pavel Tsatsouline has talked about, I believe, is like basically lactate's bad. Don't, it's going to burn up something in the muscles or something like that. And then Val was like, I disagree. And I was like, this is interesting. Like, who do I believe? I mean, this was like a decade ago for me, and I had no idea. Right. Like, I don't know who to believe here.
Right. So, yeah.
But I mean, I'm not to say that like, I don't think that by any means, I'm sure it doesn't invalidate anything with the actual method. It's just what happens, what happens if you have lactate, it isn't. I mean, I know for me, I always feel like that little bit of lactate, it's more like how much, like little bit of lactate, good. A lot of lactate, probably and there's also like that discoordination that comes with it. Something I still think about every now and then, but just practically, I guess I kind of like that, slight lactate here and there feeling.
Yeah. And I mean, when you put the Moxie on these athletes and you have them, I mean, it's all about at least like how much oxygen during, these bouts of exercise are they getting or not getting? And then you can kind of dictate the rest periods. Because I mean, Randy talks about, using Human with, the Chinese athletes. Yeah. And it's really beneficial on the recovery time. Because I think Randy talked about in your podcast where I think one of his athletes needed like a minute 30 rest because it was very individualized. And I think he said Sue needed like 3 minutes.
Yeah.
So it's not even necessarily the work bout itself, but more of, okay, how are they recovering from those work bouts to repeat it?
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. Yeah. I remember when Randy was talking about that. It actually makes me want to dig my, I have a Moxie, but the laptop, I didn't have a non-Mac laptop to run it off of. So I bought a cheap one that didn't work well, and it's still sitting here in my basement, but I might have to go try that, honestly. But anyways, I know I think that's about the end of the questions, Mark, that I had for you here. Someday I'm sure I'll have a round 3. I think actually I probably have a few I'll have to run back at you at some other point, but Man, great talking to you again. I always enjoy these conversations, and I will. I'll make sure I post in the show notes the Hunter Kavanaugh series, and just so everyone can also just get more details there.
Yep, and then you can market your tree branch.
Yeah, I'll be working. I'll be working on that. I actually made. I think I made a note here. I'm going to call it the economic constraints course or something. Economic how to constrain yourself. That's right. That's what it'll be. So, all right. Well, thank you so much, Mark. I appreciate your time, man.
Thanks again, Joel.
Thanks for tuning in to another podcast. I will see you next week.